I was really excited about this speech because when I was reading about the speech objective to connect with all of you through storytelling, I thought that this would be a really interesting way to try and connect in a little bit of a different way. Rather than me telling you stories, I thought, why don't we try to connect in a conversation about stories that probably a lot of us have been exposed to since childhood and even watched with our own children, and then maybe we can talk about a little bit of those things that have existed under the radar, things that maybe you don't even realize about these films that you've known for 30 plus years of your life. To back up, when I was in college, I took a really interesting course that was all about children's films and children's books. And the whole purpose of the class was to talk about the messages that we were introduced to as children from those stories. What did they tell us about society? What did they tell us about different groups of people? What did they tell us about appropriate language and appropriate behavior in different circumstances? The two things that I most took away from that class, and there are plenty of communications theorists and articles and essays from every institution across the country to back up these theories. The first is that film affects people differently than literature. Because while we can choose to look at the written word and decide not to read it, we don't have that same option with the messages that we see and hear from a television screen. And the second is that adults across the board often make this false assumption of innocence where children's films are concerned because they oftentimes are labeled as children's films. And the problem with that is we then perpetuate a lot of old or outdated ideas because we watch things as children ourselves, and we don't take the time to then reevaluate and we watch those things as adults in order to decide if they're really appropriate for children of a next generation. So today, I've compiled a couple of examples that I hope will help to make this point a little bit clear. How many of you have seen the film Dumbo? Just show of hands. How many of you watched this film as a kid? And now how many of you have watched this film with your own kids? A lot of hands, actually. Okay. This film came out in 1941, which is 20 years before the Civil Rights Movement actually really took off, which probably explains why the comic relief of the film is this set of drunken, smoking black crows that are actually named Jim Crow, as in the Jim Crow laws that kept segregation in place from the end of the Civil War all the way through the end of the Civil Rights Movement. And the problem, especially with these crows, to make things even worse, they're actually voiced by white actors who were told to, quote unquote, act black in order to create a caricature of African American men for the masses. Here is another example. It's a little bit of a less obvious one. I'm sure many of you have seen the original film of The Jungle Book. It came out in 1967, which was still very much a part of the heyday of Louis Armstrong and a lot of the other great, brilliant jazz musicians of that era. And so what Disney decided to do is to represent these black jazzers as monkeys, singing that they want to be human. So what you see here in this sequence is Baloo scatting with King Louie. There's a reason I brought up Louis Armstrong. And you see Baloo dress up, which, certainly gives us an opportunity to talk about presenting race as costume material, to the famous sequence, I Want to Be Like You. And the problems that came about with this representation in this sequence were actually the reason that the 2016 producers of the new Jungle Book film chose a white actor to play the role of King Louie. This is a little bit of a different instance, but this is two separate films, actually. So the first one you see on the left is actually from the Aristocats. That film came out in 1970. And the sequence represents a Siamese cat playing the piano with chopsticks and singing the words, Shanghai, Hong Kong, egg foo young, fortune cookie always wrong. Right before saying in a characterized South Asian accent, that a hot one. Then you look to the picture on the right, which is another instance of problematic representation of South Asians. It's actually from Lady and the Tramp. It's important to note that this film came out in 1945, which was the year World War II ended. And the reason that these cats were entertaining is because they played on America's fears of South Asian people that was really inspired by the war. These cats in their song, I don't know if any of you even remember this from when you were a child, but the lyrics are, "Now we look upon our new domicile. If we like, we maybe stay for quite a while." And it's entertaining because it played upon these fears of Asian immigration and Asian occupation that adults would recognize, but that children would internalize without their conscious knowledge. I will run through the rest of these very quickly for the sake of time. This is from Peter Pan, which came out in 1953, that portrays Native American people as being literally red-skinned, in addition to being infinitely more cartoonish than their white counterparts of the movie. That's before we've even gotten to the song that they sing during this sequence. If you guys Google this after this meeting, you'll find the song is actually a lot worse than you remember it being as a child. I was very surprised to watch this film as an adult. This is from Cinderella. Interestingly enough, a 1950s film, not shocking to anybody, but it presents very distinguished gender roles in terms of different projects. And this is something that we've obviously moved past, if the fact that boys sewed their own foot pillows in home ec right alongside myself and the rest of my female classmates. Just a thought, something to still be perpetuated. This is also from Peter Pan. It's a sequence where a beautiful group of mermaids literally try to drown Wendy before Peter steps in. And it perpetuates this notion that women will inevitably attack each other rather than working peacefully together, even without the presence of a male counterpart. Talk about creating the mean girls of a new generation. And this last image, I'm sure some of you will recognize, is another image from Cinderella, wherein the king, the prince's father, and it's important to note the power that comes along with that position, literally tries to kill this duke. He chases him around with a sword in multiple instances of the film after the duke fails to capture his son's intended bride after she flees from the ball. This film presents this kind of violence as being entertaining. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that elementary school teachers often have a problem with teaching their students, especially young boys, one, that violence isn't funny, and two, that power doesn't give you the authority to hurt other people. I would like to wrap this up with a quote that I really, really like from Stephen Sondheim. He's not a communications theorist. He's not a child psychologist. He's not any kind of reputable, brilliant therapist. He's just a writer. And he is 100% right when he says that you have to be careful of the things you say. Children will listen. Children will see and learn. Children will look to you for which way to turn to learn what to be. If you put a story in front of your child, you are telling that child that the messages, the language, the behaviors presented in that film are deemed appropriate by you, an adult that they trust and look up to. Their lives then get infinitely more complicated when they go out into the real world and people tell them differently. And all of a sudden your child is floundering and left wondering what is really right and wrong. Is this to say that all films are bad for kids? I certainly don't think so. However, is this to say that we often make a false assumption of innocence because movies are quoted as being made for children? Absolutely, especially where classic films are concerned. I think that stories have the power to change, they have the power to teach, and I would really hope that this speech has encouraged you to go back and take a look at the stories that you're retelling and the messages and the lessons that you're hoping that those stories will teach the kids of the next generation. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Toastmaster.